After the fall of Nazi Germany, Winston Churchill wrote, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." British survival in the early years of the war depended upon a steady flow of supplies being maintained by convoys transiting between the New World and the Old. The primary German weapon in the attempt to strangle this flow was the U-boat, and the Kriegsmarine submarine supremo, Admiral Karl Dönitz, well understood his priorities. Dönitz had learned his craft in U-boats during World War I. The Imperial German Navy was the first to make extensive use of submarines in attacking an enemy's trade. In spite of the fairly primitive nature of the boats of the time, they achieved considerable success. U-boats wreaked havoc on British trade in the Mediterranean, and the unrestricted submarine warfare of 1917 and 1918 came close to bringing Britain to its knees. It was a major reason why, after the war, Germany was denied a submarine force under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. However, this did not prevent the Weimar government from secretly planning a submarine force. And the rise of the Nazis accelerated these plans. In 1935, Hermann Göring announced Germany's intent to rearm, rejecting the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler managed to push through an Anglo-German naval agreement that allowed naval construction up to a ceiling of 45% of Britain's Royal Navy. Curiously, since the British had painful experience of what submarines could do, the agreement also allowed Germany to match the Royal Navy's submarine force, ton for ton. Dönitz was given command of Germany's first post-war submarine flotilla in 1935 and set about training a new U-boat fleet that could succeed where his generation had, by only a narrow margin, failed. As late as the summer of 1939, Hitler was telling the German Navy that there was little danger of war. The Kriegsmarine's building schedule was based on the assumption that there would be no conflict until the mid-1940s, by which time they hoped to match the Royal Navy. But when Britain and France declared war in September 1939, the Great Surface Fleet had yet to be built, and Dönitz had only 46 operational submarines, of which more than half were tiny coastal Type 2s, primarily used for training. For the first 8 months of the war, U-boat activity against Britain's vital supply lines was limited. It was almost entirely directed against the few ships which sailed independently rather than in convoy. Indeed, during the Norwegian campaign, all U-boats were withdrawn from the Atlantic for operations in the North Sea. But that was about to change. Between the wars, Dönitz had developed theoretical group attack tactics. Once in control of Hitler's U-boats, he tested the concept of the Wolf Pack. Coordinated strikes by groups of submarines far out into the ocean. Another technique Dönitz advocated was one he had learned in World War I. The most effective attacks were made on the surface at night, when the small silhouette of a submarine was hard to see. In 1939, he published a book describing these methods. No one in Britain appears to have noticed. At the outbreak of war, some 3,000 ocean-going merchant ships flew the British flag, and another 1,000 coasters plied the waters around the UK. A combined total of 17.5 million tonnes of shipping. The ships were organised into convoys, typically protected by 4 to 6 escorts armed with depth charges. It was soon apparent that Germany's small surface fleet could not inflict serious damage on the convoys. The heavy cruiser Hipper, the battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and the pocket battleships Scheer and Graf Spee snapped up a number of ships on raiding cruises. The prospect of a German battleship, or even two, getting amongst a convoy kept British naval staff awake at night. But although there were some close calls, Hitler's big ships failed to land a significant blow against the convoy routes. When massacres did occur, they were carried out by Dönitz's U-boats, as the Admiral put his pre-war theory into deadly practice. On the outbreak of war, Germany declared a war zone that first extended to 20 degrees west, about 500 miles west of Ireland. In the first months of the war, pickings were rich amongst merchantmen returning individually to the UK. U-boat commanders had a healthy respect for British destroyers, whose ASDIC underwater sound systems could detect the range and bearing of a submerged submarine. But there were never enough of them, and the frantic building programme undertaken to replace them with sloops and corvettes would take years to reach peak production. The shortage of escorts on the major routes between the UK and Canada saw convoys escorted through only 15 degrees longitude from either end. Empty ships could only be escorted to a line some 300 miles west of Ireland, where the escort would meet a heavily laden convoy coming home. In the middle of the Atlantic, the convoys were on their own. Thus begun what U-boat commanders were to call the first happy time. Early misgivings about attacking civilian liners were long gone. Merchant ships were escorted, armed, and given instructions to ram an opportunity. So the Kriegsmarine considered that an unrestricted sinking policy was legally justified. Admiral Dönitz warned that ships of any nation entering the war zone would be subject to attack, whether combatants or neutral. The crippling loss of Allied shipping in the early years of the war at sea was out of all proportion to the number of submarines causing that loss. There were rarely more than a dozen at sea at any one time. But after the fall of France, a higher proportion of the U-boat force was operational in the mid-Atlantic. They no longer had to make the long passage across the North Sea and around Scotland. The boats were now based on the Atlantic coast of France, in vast reinforced concrete submarine pens. From there, they could reach their patrol waters more quickly and could stay on station longer. The shorter journey was not without risk. To reach the shipping lanes, they had to cross the Bay of Biscay. Travelling on the surface to get into action as quickly as possible, they ran the gauntlet of British long-range aircraft and were often compelled to submerge by day and hide. In July and August 1940, 27 Italian U-boats arrived in Bordeaux. But the Italian boats were of unsuitable design, and national temperaments clashed. In the first 2 months, the Italians sank just 1 ship, while the German boats sank 80. The convoys had more to worry about than being shadowed by U-boats. There was what Winston Churchill called the scourge of the Atlantic, the Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor. It was the Germans who had first demonstrated the value of air supremacy in this particular battle. Late in 1940, they established Condor units along the Biscay coast. The FW-200s of Kampfgeschwader 40 flew a giant loop from their base near Bordeaux in France, out over the convoy routes to their northern bases in Norway, doing the same trip in reverse the following day. The idea was that once the FW-200s found a convoy, the big aircraft were used as orbiting beacons. By transmitting continuously, they provided course data, both to the High Command and for the packs of U-boats. The submarines could then home in on their transmissions. Condors were fragile and vulnerable to fighters, but the British had been too hard-pressed for many months to spare carriers or even catapult-launched aircraft to beat off the bombers. The Condors did more than spot convoys for the U-boats, however. They also bombed stragglers and independently sailing merchantmen. In the first 2 months of 1941 alone, they sank 46 ships, totalling nearly 170,000 tons. The U-boats themselves had sunk only 60 ships. Only the continued disagreement and mistrust between the Kriegsmarine and the Luftwaffe prevented a development that could have been catastrophic for the British. Once in the Atlantic, the hunt began. From his headquarters ashore, Dönitz exercised tight control over his U-boats. By radio direction finding, aerial reconnaissance, and the cracking of certain British naval codes, Dönitz enjoyed some success at predicting the course of the convoys. Air bases in Canada, Iceland, and the British West Coast enabled the Royal Air Force's Coastal Command to maintain anti-submarine patrols at either end of the convoy's journey, but not in the middle. Once a convoy reached the Atlantic Gap, it was on its own. In an attempt to evade the marauding wolf packs, British convoys were routed as far north as possible as they crossed the Atlantic. Convoys also followed zigzag routes, radical changes of course in the night being designed to lose shadowing U-boats. Operational control of the U-boat fleet was maintained from Wilhelmshaven near Hamburg, though Dönitz also had a forward headquarters in Brittany. The Kriegsmarine kept tight control of its boats, maintaining regular radio contact. Without the threat of aerial attack during the day, the U-boats could assemble in lines up to 12 miles apart. Positioned across likely convoy routes, they assembled into informal groups known as wolf packs. These were often named after pirates, famous battles, areas of Germany, or characters from Nordic mythology. More than one pack could operate at a time. Convoy SC-52 out of Nova Scotia was driven back to port by 20 U-boats from Wolfpacks Mordbrenner, Rieswolf and Schlagtord. Once a convoy was located, Dönitz assigned 1 or 2 U-boats as shadowers. These followed the convoy, reporting its course and speed to U-boat HQ. Position reports were sent to operational boats in the Atlantic, and the Wolfpack gathered for the kill. This gathering generated a lot of radio traffic, which would eventually contribute to the submarine's defeat. But until the codes were broken and direction-finding equipment perfected, Dönitz's system worked very effectively. In the early days of the war, convoys were only lightly escorted. The first boats to attack drew off the escorts, leaving later arrivals, often attacking from a wide arc, a free run-in on the hapless merchantmen. Curiously, if a U-boat submerged, it became easier to detect. These were the days before effective radar had been widely deployed aboard escorts, but they all had ASDIC detection gear, which used sound waves to search for submerged boats. The Aces were the new heroes of the Nazi pantheon. Young, aggressive skippers prepared to attack on the surface and close to point-blank range before firing their torpedoes. The top three, Kretschmer, Lute and Top, sank 121 ships of nearly 700,000 tons between them. As with fighter pilots, it was the small number of aces who inflicted most of the damage. Ace status required a score of 50,000 tons, later increased to 100,000 tons, and was recognised by the award of the Ritterkreuz, the Knight's Cross. And as triumphant captains returned to port, their crews were awarded medals too. On the dockside, by Dönitz in person. He would continue to greet his men as they made port, through that happy time and into the grim months of 1943, when U-boat losses soared to unsustainable levels. Dönitz was an inspiration to the U-boat men. His praise desired, his anger dreaded. But it was not all one-sided. If a U-boat was detected, a deadly game of cat and mouse would follow, in which the submarine, with its low underwater speed and limited submerged range, was at distinct disadvantage. The crew listened as the ping of enemy sonar echoed around them. If full speed on the electric motors and rapid alterations in course failed to shake the pursuer, they could try to escape by stealth. But all too often the U-boat men would hear the awful express train sound of a destroyer passing overhead to drop depth charges. The thunderous detonations of the explosive devices reverberated through the submarine. A near miss could smash dials, crack open valves, and plunge the boat into darkness. Bold skippers would take the boat down through the pre-war safety depth of 160 feet. The hull creaking as the pressure increased, down to and even beyond the normal maximum permissible depth of 500 feet. To escape from a particularly accurate depth-charging attack in 1939, the famous ace Otto Kretschmer dived U-99 beyond 680 feet. His gamble paid off, because early war British depth charges had a maximum depth setting of 500 feet. If the U-boat men were lucky, the escorts would lose contact, or be compelled to abandon the attack and rush to head off an attack on another part of the convoy, and the submarine could slink away. As long as the boat was not too seriously damaged, it would creep up to periscope depth after an hour or two. Catching the convoy again would be impossible while submerged, so captains would bring their boats back to the surface as soon as possible. There they could use the U-boat's superior surface speed to regain contact, ready to renew the attack the following night. Once out of torpedoes, a U-boat commander would often be instructed to continue to shadow the convoy. His task was to send position reports for the benefit of fresher boats arriving on the scene before receiving the order to return. Early in the war, boats spent a good proportion of their time on the surface. However, the biggest danger to any U-boat was that of surprise attack from the air. And as the war progressed, more and more commanders would submerge by day when in range of Allied air bases. Even so, many were caught by surprise. A well-trained crew could submerge a Type 7 U-boat in 20 seconds. The bridge lookouts hurling themselves down the ladder. The big Type 9 took up to 40 seconds to submerge in an emergency, leaving it vulnerable to air attack for much longer. Minor injuries were frequent, and terrible mistakes sometimes occurred. The first watch officer of U-451 accidentally left on the bridge when the boat crash-dived to escape a British aircraft, was rescued by a British warship. The submarine and the rest of the crew were never seen again. If North Atlantic storms and the attentions of Allied submariners were not problems enough, there was also the fact that life aboard a U-boat was hard at the best of times. The boat was packed with weapons, engines, batteries, equipment and supplies. There was little room for the crew, who could be at sea for up to 60 days. The bow compartment was home to 24 men, who had to share it with the torpedoes. At least half were on duty at any one time, so they took turns to sleep in collapsible bunks or hammocks. There was no privacy, nor were there any real washing facilities, so the atmosphere reeked of body odours, motor oil and stale food. The captain, his 3 officers and 5 senior petty officers shared the next compartment aft. The captain's bunk was on the port side. The other side of the central passageway were the radio and sonar rooms. The officer's compartment also housed the toilet, shared by the whole crew. There was another aft near the galley, but this was invariably used to store provisions. The 6-metre-long control room was aft of the officer's compartment. In the middle was a cylindrical tube with a ladder inside, leading up into the cramped conning tower that housed a duplicate helm station, engine telegraph and the attack periscope. The conning tower opened out onto the bridge, where 4 lookouts were posted when the boat was on the surface. Each man was responsible for one 90-degree segment of the horizon, peering through Zeiss binoculars. The safety of the boat depended on their vigilance. There was no radar on board. Behind the control room was a compartment with 8 bunks for the petty officers, lockers for the crew's personal possessions, and the boat's galley. A 3-ring electric stove, 2 small ovens, and a tiny sink. Then came the engine room, a narrow passageway running between 2 diesel engines, and beyond that, the electric motor compartment. An air pipe ran from the engines up to the top of the bridge structure, keeping the engine's air intake as far above sea level as possible. The diesels propelled the boat on the surface and charged the electric batteries that powered it underwater. The batteries themselves were housed beneath the deck. Food was stored everywhere when the boat put to sea. In the early days of a patrol, hams, sausages and mesh bags of bread hung from the ceiling, with cheeses and canned food crammed into every bit of space. To extend the duration of long-range operations, the Kriegsmarine adopted a technique originally developed during the First World War. Milch cows were large supply submarines, stationed at pre-arranged locations away from the sea lanes. U-boats would rendezvous with the milch cows where they would take on fuel, torpedoes and supplies. This allowed the boats to stay on patrol for months at a time. The Type 7, the workhorse of the Kriegsmarine's U-boat fleet, had no air conditioning or proper heating. On patrols to the Caribbean, the temperature inside often reached 35 degrees Celsius. By contrast, boats wreaking havoc on American shipping off the US East Coast in January 1942 recorded internal temperatures down to 0 degrees Celsius day after day. Throughout 1940, U-boats were being lost faster than they could be produced. And by January 1941, there were just 22 boats operational, fewer than the number available in September 1939. Even so, from July 1940 until the worsening winter weather and more numerous escort vessels began to have effect, the U-boats had a devastating impact. They sank 520 ships, totaling 2.4 million tons by December 1940. They would have sunk considerably more, but German torpedoes were not reliable and would not become so until late 1941. By the end of 1940, the picture looked very bleak for the British. Convoy losses had reached such proportions that defeat through starvation threatened the United Kingdom. Throughout 1941, the massacre of Allied merchant shipping continued. The genuine fears of the British government and the Royal Navy, the universal impact of rationing, and horror stories like the destruction of convoy SC7 created an enduring impression. In October 1940, SC7 was sailing from Canada when U-boats struck. Only 12 of 34 ships survived. But the picture was misleading. For every convoy decimated in this way, many others reached Britain without serious loss. By December 1941, the British had sailed some 900 convoys, and of 12,000 inbound ships, the U-boats had sunk less than 300. And by this time, the best of the pre-war trained U-boat men were at the bottom of the Atlantic in the shattered hulls of their iron coffins. Few aces enjoyed their glory for long. Prien and Schepke had been killed in March, and Kretschmer had been captured. The Battle of the Atlantic changed dramatically when Hitler declared war on the United States at the end of 1941. Dönitz had anticipated his chief's decision and had sent 5 Type 9 boats to the US coast 48 hours before the declaration.
Im zweiten Teil seiner Rede hielt der Führer schonungslose Abrechnung mit dem Kriegshetzer und Heuchler Franklin Roosevelt.
With the entry of America into the war, Dönitz's men now had a new challenge. They would have to sink Allied merchant ships faster than the world's most powerful economy could build them. For a brief time, the second happy time, they did. Slow American reactions to the U-boat threat left merchantmen sailing individually without escort. Until a proper convoy system was established, the U-boats wreaked havoc on America's eastern seaboard. From the opening of hostilities, the big Type 9s had worked the western and southern Atlantic. Now they ravaged shipping sailing individually down the eastern seaboard of North America. When the US Navy set up a proper convoy system, the Type 9s moved down to the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. where they wreaked more havoc among the vital tanker traffic coming out of Texas and Venezuela. But even with the staggering loss of merchant ships, the tide was slowly beginning to turn against the U-boats. Although it wasn't immediately apparent, the second happy time was coming to an end. What the convoys needed was better protection, improved defensive tactics, and better sub-detection equipment. Fortunately, these measures had been taken just in time. Already by 1941, with the danger of German invasion past, fast escort destroyers could be released from British home waters, while smaller escort vessels were coming off the slips at an increasing rate. Most significant of all, British scientists had made a major breakthrough: practical and effective airborne radar that would allow surfaced U-boats to be detected day or night, whatever the weather. Despite some notable setbacks, most convoys still managed to cross with little incident. Close cover now became possible for the whole crossing, not least because of the crucial expansion of the Royal Canadian Navy. A sustained air offensive against transiting U-boats in the Bay of Biscay also produced an excellent return. Having contacted a convoy, submarines were now likely to find an escort carrier providing local air cover to keep them down, while cruising escort groups quickly reinforced the close escort at the onset of any threat. But these measures were painfully slow to take effect. During 1942, the picture was even darker than the previous year. Allied losses totaled nearly 1,700 ships, nearly 8 million tons. Even worse, U-boat operational strength was rising fast, from 91 boats in January to 212 in December. As Churchill was to write, the U-boat campaign of 1942 was our worst evil. The climax of the campaign came in March 1943. The Allies lost more than 500,000 tons of shipping in that month alone. But from then on, it was the U-boats which suffered. Between May and August, 98 new U-boats were commissioned, but 123 were lost. Each represented a trained crew, perished or prisoner. Despite the horrendous loss rate, and in the face of Allied efforts to disrupt the German building program by bombing, total U-boat strength remained well over 400 until the end of hostilities. But their North Atlantic success rate declined dramatically. 463 ships were sunk in 1943, but only 132 in 1944. The Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic was arguably the single most important of the war. It was a close-run thing. Even though only 1 in 3 U-boats actually sank an Allied vessel, their operations cost the Allies some 14 million tons of shipping. U-boats also accounted for 158 British warships and 27 from the US Navy. But whatever the losses the Allies suffered, the U-boats suffered more. New submarines armed with new weapons had arrived, but they were too little, too late to make a difference. The professional submariners who had brought Britain to the brink of ruin early in the war were nearly all dead, along with their crews. Their successors, less highly trained, less experienced, and facing far more capable Allied defences, stood little chance of affecting the outcome of the war. Yet still, they went to sea. Even though they returned to base in smaller and smaller numbers, they continued to fight hard for a bad cause. Being a U-boat crewman was without doubt the most dangerous occupation of the war. More than 1,100 boats were built between 1935 and 1945, of which 863 sailed on operational patrols. No fewer than 754 were lost in action. 27,000 U-boat crewmen died, with a further 5,000 being taken prisoner. This frightening casualty rate of 85% was far and away the highest in any theatre of the conflict. Even people who were sent to concentration camps had a better chance of survival than these doomed warriors of the Reich. And what was their sacrifice for? Ultimately, for nothing. But there was a time when the U-boat crews could have won the war for Hitler.